Double murder trial of Alec Murdaugh, the disgraced former South Carolina attorney accused of killing his wife and son. Today, jurors visited the estate where the murders happened, spending about 30 minutes touring the property.
CNN's Diane Gallagher is outside the courtroom in Walterboro, South Carolina. So jurors, they could begin today.
That is the operative word there, Victor, could. And I can tell you we are in the thick of Prosecutor Creighton Waters' closing arguments right now. In total, he's been speaking for about an hour and a half. He is right now speaking about the murders themselves, focusing hard on 8:49 p.m., the last time that there was any activity on Paul or Maggie Murdaugh's phones before they locked forever, noting to the jury that neither had any defensive wounds. Waters then pointed at Alec Murdaugh in the courtroom and said it's because it's him, referring to who the killer was. Now, up until this point, Waters has been going through the background, as he's been doing for nearly 6 weeks, into the financial crimes that Alec Murdaugh is accused of, trying to build toward explaining why they believe this man would kill his wife and his son. He then explained it's all there to the jury. You just have to put the pieces together.
And that's the situation that was arriving in June of 2021, when he was at the scene with the victims minutes before they died and lied to everyone who would listen.
Now, the state actually opened their opening statements back when the trial began, acknowledging that the majority of their case is circumstantial evidence. And so he did spend quite a bit of time at the beginning of his closing arguments talking about what reasonable doubt actually means, something I also expect the defense to talk about quite a bit in their closing arguments. Now, the beginning of the day, the jury actually took a trip out to the crime scene, to the Murdaugh family property where the murders happened, Moselle. There was no media allowed when they were there, although both defense attorneys and prosecutors were there, as well as Judge Newman. The jurors were not allowed to speak to anybody, but according to the media pool that got to tour the facility afterward, they said they did see jurors sort of standing around the dog kennels where the murders happened, standing in the feed room door, one juror looking up at the door frame. That is where Paul Murdaugh was murdered. And so we're watching these jurors, according to the pool, sort of go around this property. The media pool described it as feeling almost haunted, but noted that there was no staining, no blood still there on the property. The grass had kind of grown up, and there was still signs of a family that used to once live there, instead of it now being a murder scene that many of the people who come out to this trial to watch and try to get inside every day, who are these true crime fans, have actually tried to go out there and see themselves. Now, Victor, Biana, we talked about the fact that the defense could be doing its closing arguments. That's all going to depend on the prosecution and how long he takes today. Either way, we are in the home stretch here. We are nearing the end of this double murder trial for Alec Murdaugh.
Yeah, it was interesting that the pool reporter noted when they went out there to the estate, just the scale and the size of the land there. And it was just, they put into perspective just what they were dealing with and why it took so long for responders to get there in the first place. Diane Gallagher, thank you. Well, with us now is criminal defense attorney Bernarda Villalona. Thank you so much, Bernarda, for joining us. So one thing that stood out to me from what we heard from Prosecutor Creighton Waters today in his closing comments here and its arguments was he said about Murdaugh. He said, after an exhaustive investigation, there's only one person who had the motive, who had the means, who had the opportunity to commit these crimes, and whose guilt conduct after these crimes betrays him. From what you heard throughout this trial, do you think the prosecution was able to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt?
Exactly. So we heard the start of these closing arguments because I expect it to be a couple hours. So the prosecution has already emphasized to the jury that the only person that could have done this is Alec Murdaugh, because he had the motive, the means, and an opportunity. Now, in terms of have they proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt? Yes, they put forward credible evidence. However, the defense has also been able to poke holes into the prosecution's case. I think it's going to come down to these closing arguments arguments. And just remember this, closing arguments are not evidence. The purpose of closing arguments is for the prosecution to point out to the jury how they've proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, as opposed to the defense pointing out to the jury how the prosecution has not proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that there are multiple reasonable doubts in this case. So we'll have to wait and see until the conclusion of these arguments, because it wasn't a concrete case to begin with.
Yeah, the burden, of course, is on the state. I mean, the defense doesn't have to say or do anything, but of course they will in these closing arguments. I wonder, if you're on the defense team here, what do you drive home in that closing?
So the defense, what they've been driving home from opening statements and throughout every witness that has come in to testify, is the character of Alex Murdaugh, how much he loved his family and is not capable of blowing the head off of his very son and of his loved wife of so many years. And with that emphasis, then it cuts down to the motive that the prosecution has been putting forward. Yes, he's a liar. Yes, he stole a lot of money. Yes, he's on drugs, but he's not capable of killing two individuals that he is so close to. Also, that the lack of evidence in terms of the firearms that were used in this crime wasn't recovered. You can't really put Alex Murdaugh definitively right inside of the kennels at the time of death. And also the forensic and how the police and law enforcement handled this crime scene. And the $1 million question for the defense: is it one shooter or two shooters? And those are all things that linger in the minds of the jury, and the prosecution has to make an effort to drive it home that there was one shooter, and that one shooter is Alex Murdaugh.